And that there, ladies and gentlemen, is the key to longevity. This is the key to flicking that switch or pulling that lever, to expressing our genome and allowing us to beat our epigenetics and become fitter and healthier. So let's get into this. During my mid to late 20s, I was clinically obese, type 2 diabetic. I suffered with chronic fatigue, depression, anxiety, arthritic pains, daily debilitating migraines would make me blind. I was on a myriad of medications, and I could barely walk up a flight of stairs without stopping or being severely out of breath. And this was my diet. It predominated carbohydrate, particularly from grains, because I believed this to be healthy. I won't bore you all with this, but a super long story short, I changed my diet, and all of these things occurred. So I lost 107 pounds. I reversed my diabetes. I was now migraine-free, depression-free, anxiety-free, normalized blood pressure, and more importantly, medication-free. All of those things occurred within 12 months of changing my diet to an animal-based lifestyle. And it was through incremental changes. I began low carb and became keto and then carnivore. Now, for full disclosure, this image didn't take 12 months. This was like 4 to 5 years, but it's an incremental process. Now, the reason I've put this in is that my journey saw me from becoming clinically obese to incredibly small. And then I began competing as an amateur bodybuilder. I managed to build an incredible amount of lean muscle mass without carbohydrate. The fallacy that we need carb to build muscle, it is indeed just that. It's a fallacy. Carbohydrates do not build muscle. So this was me winning I think this was the British Championship, or maybe a comp around this time. I went on to become European champion in Britain and Europe at a pro level. So I was number 1 in Europe as a professional bodybuilder in men's physique. Now look at the image on the right. This was me when I was 3 stone lighter than me at my heaviest. I was 17 to 17 and a half stone at my heaviest. I know this because I had to drop the weight in order to do this parachute jump. I needed to be just under 14 stone. When I was there, I did the parachute jump with my sister. It was a tandem jump. So my sister had an instructor and I had an instructor. And what they taught us was that the weight distribution needed to be evened out. When my sister's instructor came in, he was a large gentleman because of the weight distribution. And then my instructor walked in and he was tiny. And I'm sitting there scratching my head thinking, well, if what you say is true, why have I got this tiny little guy? And they both looked at me as if to say, how do we tell you that you're fat? You know? And I was clinically obese, but it's mad that we don't see what's straight in front of us in the mirror. I paid an absolute fortune to have pictures and videos of this parachute jump, which never saw the light of day, because when I saw how clinically obese I was and I had a hamster face, I was mortified. And this was the start of my journey. I did actually put on another 3 stone and went back up to 17 and 17 and a half stone because, again, I was trying to eat what I believed was healthy. I was eating off the food pyramid, the eat well pit. I predominated grains. I would consume cereal in the morning with my banana, essentially consuming sugar with extra sugar. But I didn't know that at the time because the general consensus is these compounds are very good for us. I was avoiding the saturated fats. I was doing everything that I was told to do. So I've come away from the bodybuilding and now I do endurance sports, and I do this to help others in regards to training and athletic performance. But these images were taken 15 years apart. Now you can see the image on the right, I'm incredibly inflamed. I'm full of boils. And what you actually can't see there is I'm wearing foundation. I'm wearing makeup to hide the severity of the boils on my skin. My skin was absolutely awful. 15 years later, I think I look younger and there's not a blemish on there. You know, you can't change how ugly I am in my face, but still my skin looks a lot better. You know, so these were 15 years apart. And the reason I tell you this is that people will blame epigenetics. It's in my genes. It's not my fault. It's my genetics. It runs in my family. These are the things that people will mention time and time again. And let's fast forward. These look like 2 different people. Where do my genetics come from? Where am I head? If you look at the image on the right, and this is where I'm heading. This was my father. If you look in his face, you can see me. This was my fate. This is where it runs in my family. This is where my genetics were taking me. Now, my father died a number of years ago at 62 from heart complications. Now, can you see this person becoming a British and European champion? Can you see him becoming a 3% body fat? Because this is what I achieved, 3% body fat. And in fact, this was taken a number of weeks after winning the British or European champion, where I would argue, given the fact I'm 3 there, that I was closer to 2%. Now, this isn't healthy. I'm not saying that 2% or 3% is healthy. The reason that I'm saying this is the fact that I was able to achieve this, yet my genetics were telling me otherwise. I've beaten my genetics. So I don't resign to the fact that we are governed by genetics. And the reason for this is epigenetics. And I won't bore you guys too much with this, but for those of you who don't know what epigenetics is, most of us only access a portion of our DNA. And we can quite literally flick the switch and enable us to access different parts of our DNA. And if you don't understand what this is, it doesn't matter, because I'm going to break it down and explain it in simple terms. But at the end of this, you will be able to explain to other people in very simple terms what epigenetics is and what protein synthesis is. So let's get into this. So these are our chromosomes, and these are found in the nucleus in almost every cell within the body. And this is where we find our DNA. So if we were to take out the chromosome, and then if we were to pull the chromosome apart, we'd see this string, if you like. This is our DNA. The chromosomes are made up of our DNA, wound and wound tightly around groups of proteins called histones. And that's what these circles represent there. These histones are made up of 8 proteins, 4 pairs of proteins called histones. These are histone proteins. Now, if you were to reach into a cell in my body and pull out a strand of DNA in any one cell in my body, out and out and out, it would reach over 6 foot of linear DNA. I can't even comprehend that. How incredible is this? The way that it keeps it in the cell is that it wraps it around these histone proteins. And what happens in the human body countless amounts of times throughout the day is we take photocopies of this DNA and we send it to a different part of the cell called the ribosome as mRNA. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, RNA is ribonucleic acid. The M is messenger, so we've taken a photocopy of the DNA, and messenger RNA will then send it to a different part of the cell called the ribosome, which I've depicted there as a machine. And this machine reads the code on the DNA, because that's what our DNA is, sets a code. And as we mentioned earlier, each part contains 3 different nucleotides, and collectively they're called codons. As they run through this machine allocates its signals tRNA, transfer RNA, to bring in an amino acid. When we consume animal proteins, these animal proteins are broken down into amino acids, and then via this is what protein synthesis is. Our bodies reconstitute it into human proteins. So as it runs through this machine, each codon will allocate an amino acid, and it will bring another and another and another until it binds them together, creating a chain of amino acids called a peptide. And these peptides will go on to create proteins. And that's what these images on the left depict. These are human proteins. These proteins then go on to heal and repair every cell in the body. They build and heal everything in the body, including the kidneys. We can't live without this process. And this is what protein synthesis is. And again, it comes from our DNA. Now, this is just to depict that these histone proteins have tails. They have lots of different tails, but I've referenced one here, and this is a lysine tail. Under a microscope, it doesn't look like this. This is for image purposes, the explanation basically around how this works. So all of these proteins have this lysine tail, and they have a high affinity to certain enzymes. And what happens is certain enzymes will bind to these tails, and they will cause a certain response within the chromatin or the chain of DNA. Now, there's 2 I've referenced here, and there are lots of others. But this is called this is called acetylation. So when it comes to acetylation at the core of the DNA, we have HATs and HDACs. So HATs is our histone acetyltransferase, and the HDACs is our histone deacetylase. Now, depending on which one binds, governs what happens to this chromatin or our DNA wrapped around these proteins. Now, when the HDACs bind, they cause the chromatin to become closed, tighten up. And when they bind with the HATs, they become open and available for expression. Now, one isn't good and one isn't bad, but the expression needs to be available. And the body needs to preference certain parts of the DNA. Otherwise, we don't photocopy the right DNA. We make mismatched photocopies, which causes problems. So we want the DNA to be open and available for expression. And this is what the HATs will do. So when the HATs bind, it releases the chromatin, makes it available, and becomes open and apart and available for expression. And therefore, we can perform this protein synthesis at a much more efficient level. So this is what we need to happen in the body. There are a number of different mechanisms we can have. We're all familiar with methylation. where we can have DNA methylation, phosphorylation, and the list goes on and on. So there are lots of different mechanisms, but they all follow a similar protocol, even when it comes to cancers, for example. So what we want is this open and a part available for expression, and diet and lifestyle can contribute to this. So the biggest contributing factor is what we eat. What we eat can directly affect at the level of the DNA. So it doesn't get any smaller than this. We've gone deep into the cell and we've taken it right down to our DNA. It doesn't get any smaller. Food impacts how we make changes and how we express our DNA. This is incredible. This means that we have control over how the body heals and repairs. We have control on our health and well-being. And this is what epigenetics is. So what type of foods allow us to express this at the best possible way? So let's take a quick look at some superfoods. And this is why I wanted to show you this. Broccoli. We're told that broccoli is a superfood. Now, before we get into this, I want you to understand some terminologies. I want you to understand what genotoxic means. Genotoxic means damaging to the DNA. Another thing that I want you to become aware of is that broccoli contains a compound called isothiocyanate. In fact, it doesn't contain isothiocyanate. The isothiocyanate is produced when we chew on the broccoli. When we bite a piece of broccoli, myrosinase binds to glucoraphanin and it creates sulforaphane, which is an isothiocyanate. So when we eat it, it's created, i.e., when the plant becomes under attack. Now, it's important to remember that you and I, if we're under attack, we fight back or we run away. Other animals have this response. Plants cannot run away. They're rooted to the ground, so they have defense chemicals. And again, this is a fact. All plants have defense chemicals, phytoalexins, plant toxins that they use to ward off predators, for example. And isothiocyanate is one of these compounds. It goes on to say in this that isothiocyanates are groups of natural compounds found in cruciferous vegetables, including broccoli and cabbage and kale. They contain sulfur and contribute to cancer chemotherapy treatment. Chemo preventative properties. Let's go on to the next part of what I want to show you, which is this study. So what they did is they juiced cruciferous vegetables in this and looked at its effect on the DNA. What are the first two words within the report of this? Genotoxic. Yet we've just found out that genotoxic means damaging to the DNA. And then if we read on further, it goes on to say that genotoxic effect of juices are due to specific constituents of cruciferous plants, such as glucosinolates and or their breakdown products, in particular isothiocyanates, which we've just been told is found in broccoli. Okay. So on one hand, it's saying a genotoxic effect, which means damaging DNA. And then it's saying it contains this compound, which is meant to be beneficial. And then it goes on to say the present findings clearly indicate that cruciferous vegetables contain DNA damaging constituents. So what does this mean in simple terms? This means that broccoli damages our DNA. So if we take it back to this level of the DNA, the strands of DNA, which are so important to protein synthesis in healing and repairing the body, broccoli is not a compound that we want to consume to keep this intact and to allow this process to occur. So what about the chemotherapy treatments from sulforaphane? Yes, it can. So sulforaphane is used in chemotherapy. But the problem with this is chemotherapy also damages healthy cells. Broccoli damages healthy cells and in fact leads to a whole host of downstream deleterious effects in regards to problems with every cell within the body. And these are just some of the dangers involved with chemotherapy treatment. I would advise against it, and I would preference removing the compound that has caused this in the first place, which is glucose, by the way. And again, a talk for another day. But glucose is the fuel for cancer cells, glucose and glutamate. But glutamate is downstream of the glucose. And again, this comes from an epigenetic response, which we can get into on another day. But in simple terms, cells lose their ability for oxidative phosphorylation, i.e. they can't produce energy correctly. So they go into a process of fermentation where they will ferment glucose into lactic acid. And this is what will fuel the cell. And this is done via fructose also, by the way, which is found in fruits. So fructose in fruits ferments. So, I'm not saying that fruits may cause cancer, but I'm not saying that they do not. But anyway, I'll leave that food for thought, as they say. I'll leave that up to you guys. Let's move on really quickly. And I don't want to bore you guys too much, but if we take a look at this image, and I've labeled these images for the simple reason that if we look at the image on the top right, it resembles the male genitalia. And I don't want to confuse the listeners. So we've labeled these. On the top left, we've got the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases thyroid releasing hormone to the pituitary, which is what the image on the top right is. And the pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone. And this goes to the thyroid. And then the thyroid makes T4, which goes on to make T3. Now, bear this in mind because this is really important as we go on to the next slide. Again, compounds found in these cruciferous vegetables. And again, just highlighting the isothiocyanates, which are found in broccoli, cabbage, and kale, and so on and so forth. Yes, isothiocyanates affect the thyroid because these isothiocyanates block the absorption of iodine at the thyroid. The thyroid needs iodine in order to produce the T4 and go on to produce T3. The consumption of these cruciferous vegetables and the constituents found within, i.e. the sulforaphane and the isothiocyanates, block the absorption of iodine, creating and leading to things like goitrogens. So if you suffer with thyroid disorder, if you have thyroid functioning problems, then you need to remove these cruciferous vegetables because this sulforaphane, these isothiocyanates, directly inhibit the thyroid's ability to absorb. So far, doesn't sound like a strong argument coming from the plant kingdom. But let's move on to another known superfood, because that's what these are. They're meant to be superfoods, quote unquote. Now, Popeye said that spinach is very high in iron, and it is. Spinach contains lots of iron, but this iron is tightly bound to oxalate, therefore making it unavailable for us to use within the human body. The human body needs heme iron, and spinach contains non-heme iron, which means we can't use it. We can't access the iron in there. But what it does contain lots of, as we just mentioned, is oxalate. And this, where it's got raphides multiplied by 1,000 times, is actually taken through a microscope, and it shows what these oxalates and raphides create under a microscope. They're needles. And these needles find their way into tissues in the body, in things like the kidney, for example, which we mentioned earlier, and other things, other points within the body, and they lead to a whole host of problems. Just take a look at the volume of oxalate found in some of these compounds. So we've got licorice, 3,500 milligrams per 100 grams. New Zealand spinach, 1,700, over 1,700 milligrams per 100 grams. If we look to the bottom, spinach that has been cultivated through different times of the year, as little as 600 per 100, and then as much as 1,000 per 100. Now, packs even of spinach found in the UK are sold generally in 200-gram pouches, which means that these images or these figures on the bottom left, we can multiply by 2, which means there's as much as 2,000 milligrams of oxalate found in said pack of spinach. Now, let's move on to the next slide. Why are these oxalates a problem? Because these oxalates cause breast cancer. They cause kidney stone formation. They cause thyroid problems. They damage the thyroid and cause thyroid dysfunction. They lead to joint pains. So many of the effects that we see through things like arthritic pains are not arthritic pains. They are caused quite often by oxalate buildup. The oxalate is bound to calcium, found its way into the joints and caused these issues. And quite often, when clients of mine remove these compounds that are high in oxalates, like turmeric, by the way, turmeric is also incredibly high in oxalate. These pains quite often go away. Now, how much of oxalates are detrimental to human consumption? So let's look at the glyoxylate pathway. So humans produce around 10 to 30 milligrams of oxalate each day via the glyoxylate pathway, which is a pathway that breaks down glycine and hydroxyproline, which are basically our collagens, for example. So the body does this, but oxalates are a waste product. 10 to 30 milligrams, the body has the ability to excrete comfortably up to 100 milligrams. Let's read the results from the study on the bottom. The minimal dose of oxalate causing death in adults is as little as 4 to 5 grams. 4 to 5 grams is 4,000 to 5,000 milligrams. let's go back and take a look at the amounts that we've just recognized that are found in packs of spinach. New Zealand spinach, for example, as much as 1,800 milligrams per 100 grams, which means that contains 3,500 milligrams in one pack of spinach. This is almost enough that has been known in documented cases to cause death. Now, for full disclosure, this generally happens in people who are insulin resistant and suffer with inflammation. But let's take a step back. Almost every person on that high street is insulin resistant and suffers with inflammation. As a species, we suffer with insulin resistance and inflammation. And my point to this is that these oxalate accumulate over time. They accumulate over time. 15,000 milligrams of oxalate will kill each of us. 15,000 milligrams. If we are looking at the spinach that are recorded on the bottom right-hand side of that screen and look at the top end of 1,000, multiplied by 2 for that 200-gram pouch, that's 2,000 milligrams. This means 7 packs of spinach, 8 packs of spinach could be enough to kill you and I. Now, that is incredibly scary because a pack of spinach, when you chuck it into the pan, reduces to a small amount. And yes, some of this is denatured and so on and so forth, but the oxalates are still found in there. Now, what I used to do, I used to add a pack of spinach or 2 to my smoothies, and I used to add turmeric and black pepper. And again, the black pepper blocks UDP glucuronosyl transferase, the enzyme that is involved in phase 2 detoxification in the liver that is trying to remove these compounds. And we add this black pepper and it prevents the body from doing this. It prevents that glucuronidation that we mentioned via the elevation of glutathione. These compounds are detrimental and they cause issues. And as little as 4,000 to 5,000 milligrams can cause death. And I've seen papers since I've done this presentation, which has shown, one paper showed 3,000 milligrams causing death in an adult human being. But what can this do to our children? What can this do to our children? You know, we make these smoothies and, you know, you and I have drunk them through our journey and it's caused lots of problems. But what if we give them to our kids? They're going to be way more susceptible to the volume of oxalate that their body can detox. So it gives us some food for thought. Let's come on to kale. Kale is high in vitamin C, and we've just mentioned earlier that it contains around 93 milligrams per 100 grams. It contains more vitamin C than citrus fruits, but it's not a better source because kale contains flavonoids, and flavonoids block the absorption, as this says at the bottom study there. The flavonoids can inhibit the uptake of the vitamin C. So a compound found within the kale actually binds and prevents it from being absorbed within the body. And if we go back to this, kale is particularly rich in quercetin. Well, that sounds fantastic. Let's eat kale for quercetin. Yet, quercetin is a known endocrine disruptor. Quercetin, and I'm going to read this out, quercetin can decrease the expression of genes. Coming back to the DNA, we don't want to decrease expression of the genes. Why do we want to decrease expression of the genome? It just doesn't make sense. So now kale is decreasing expression. Kale is damaging our DNA. And it goes on to restrict thyrotropin and thyroid peroxidase and thyroglobulin, basically reducing the thyroid's ability to absorb iodine. So it's not just the broccoli. We've got the kale add into this. So quercetin is also a known endocrine disruptor. And on top of this, endocrine disruptors cause lots of issues. Even when you look at soy products contain genistein, which is a phytoestrogen. Now, all of these compounds are known as flavonoids. Nerinogen is another one that gets lots of airtime as being beneficial, but these are compounds that are digestive inhibitors. They block the absorption of vitamin C, and this can reduce the body's ability in net protein utilization, which means that we don't perform this whole process that we've just mentioned of protein synthesis. It can cause infertility in both men and women. It reduces sperm count in men. It can cause gynecomastia in men. It activates the 17B estradiol receptor, blocking thyroid peroxidase and therefore the ability to make thyroid hormone. It leads to hypothyroidism in women. It can lead to increase in inflammatory markers like interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, and so on and so forth. And again, as the slide shows there, soy contains genistein Onions contain things like quercetin, and berries contain compounds like anthocyanin. There's just a handful of studies there which show this, and these studies are available in abundance. So we're not just making this stuff up. Flaxseed, we're told, is a good source of omega-3s, except it's not. Flaxseed contains ALA, then we need EPA, episopentanoic, and docosahexaenoic, or DHA. EPA and DHA, studies have shown the conversion of ALA into EPA and DHA is almost non-existent when we consume seeds, for example, that are meant to be high in omega-3s. But what seeds do contain lots of is cyanide. Seeds contain hydrocyanic acid, which breaks down into cyanide. This isn't something that is, we look back hundreds of years, it doesn't happen anymore. This occurred in Uganda. When was it? 2017. 2 people died as a result of cyanide poisoning coming from cassava roots. So these things are happening in modern times. And what this study highlights is the progressive buildup and overload of hydrocyanic acid within the human body, and how we can achieve a potential lethal dose incredibly quickly by consuming copious amounts of these hydrocyanic acids. And let me just go back to one of the original screens there, just to highlight, this is a process that happens. Imagine this pen is our DNA. We take photocopies of this DNA in order to build human proteins countless amounts of times throughout the DNA. The products or the compounds that I've just told you, damaged DNA, all come from the plant kingdom. They come from the plant kingdom and the fruit kingdom. And we didn't go into fruits and teas and so on, but it's a similar story with them, I promise. And in fact, something else that we didn't touch on, what does actually build and allow this expression of DNA? And I will humor myself. There is something that builds the telomeres on the ends of the DNA. So telomeres, we can think of being caps which protect the chromosome, and these are reduced every time the cell divides or replicates, and we have a limited amount, and this is reduced by age. But the telomere length is directly correlated with longevity. Now, there's only one thing on the planet which has been shown to increase this telomere length. Red meat increases telomere length, and this study isn't alone. This study has been replicated again and again and again. Red meat increases the telomere length, the very thing that the plants are destroying and damaging. So one thing I wanted to show you was this. Ketones increase NAD+, and for anyone who knows what NAD+ is, again, NAD+ is reduced as we create energy. Ketones increase this. And ketones also inhibit the HDACs. So remember what we said earlier in regards to, so plants increase the HDACs, which cause the compression, if you like, of the chromatin and leaving less of the DNA available for expression. Ketones inhibit the histone deacetylase, therefore leaving the HATs, the histone acetyltransferase, available for expression, allowing the chromatin to become open and available for expression. Animal proteins, natural fats, and avoiding things like plants and vegetables. This is how we activate and elicit an epigenetic response, and this is how we can quite literally beat our genetics. And coming back to that original picture that I showed you guys, my father, just to reiterate, died at 62 of heart complications. Despite only living less than 10 miles down the road, he didn't want anything to do with me growing up. And it's a shame, because if he did, then I would have had the information to pass on and maybe help him prevent this. But that is my fate. So when we look at genes, it's in my genes. It runs in my family. Well, this is what runs in my family. Yet, I have beaten this via epigenetics, which has come through lowering carbohydrate, avoiding the vegetable oils, avoiding the vegetables, removing the fruits, and consuming natural fats, including saturated fats, and animal proteins. And that there, ladies and gentlemen, is the key to longevity. This is the key to flicking that switch or pulling that lever, to expressing our genome and allowing us to beat our epigenetics and become fitter and healthier. Just eat meat. It is as simple as this, and I'm going to get that logoed on my top. I think, eating meat or carnivore, conferring a benefit for 3.4 million years. live the way that is ancestrally appropriate, and you will not just survive, but you will thrive.
Absolutely. Incredible, mate. Thanks very much for sharing that.